It is finally time to finish wrapping up my last year of reading with my 2025 statistics video, and hold tight guys because I have some juicy findings to report. So I'll start this video the way I always start these videos, by telling you guys that this one is one for my nerdy nerds. This is all of the numbers, all of my statistics, all of the graphs and charts generated by my reading spreadsheet regarding my last 12 months of reading. Last year I told you guys that I may not be making stats videos anymore, that my 2024 wrap up could be my last one, but you guys were so enthusiastic in letting me know that you wanted this video to remain an annual staple. So we are back to wrap up 2025, baby, and damn am I glad, because my compromise was to skip the mid-year check-in version of this video. So I have not analyzed any of the statistics from my spreadsheet at all during 2025, and when I made my notes for this video, guys, I was a little bit shocked. So you're gonna have to buckle up. I always get questions about my reading spreadsheet, and the one that I use I do not share because it is actually a hodgepodge of two different spreadsheets made by different creators. So the main body of my spreadsheet was created by Ali from With Ali in 2019, and I've just continued to update it through the years for my own personal use, and I've added some things, taken some things away. Ali does have a reading tracker available on Etsy, which I will link down below. There'll be like updated versions for updated years, and that is way more extensive than the one that I currently use. But if you want something that's going to generate obviously similar statistics, Ali is probably your person to go to. The second spreadsheet I use is the Corpile spreadsheet created by G from Book Roast. Corpile is a rating system, and I have kind of spliced the rating system part of G's spreadsheet into mine, but I know that the actual Corpile spreadsheet that G shares has more than just the rating system in it, if you would like to utilize that one instead. So both of those will be linked down below. I have put no effort into tracking or monitoring anything regarding my reading over the last year. So I went in with no goals in mind in terms of the statistics that we're going to talk about. For 2024, I had a couple of goals. One was to read twice as many sequels as series I started. I did fail that, but I did an okay job at trying to keep up with it. I have not done that this year, as you are going to see. And I also wanted to read at least the same amount of books as I hauled. I didn't want to be hauling more than I've read. I hauled slightly more than I read this year, but it's nothing significant, and I'm still kind of like happy with that ratio. But I didn't go into 2025 with any goals like that. I kind of thought that I would stick to the same goals from 2024 but put no conscious effort into it, and man does it show. And the only thing that I can say that I actually focused on in the last year was episodes of Shelved or Scrap It. And I feel like that's also quite evident in the stats, because some of these are quite different. Some of the statistics that have been very stable and consistent for the last 3 or 4 years are no longer stable and consistent, and we're going to talk about it today. I do sometimes share my goals for the next year in this video. I once again don't really have any, nothing that can be tracked anyway. I have made some changes to my spreadsheet, which we'll talk about throughout the course of this video, but my general goals for the year are comprehension over consumption. I actually don't mind if I read a little bit less this year. I just want to enjoy and engage with the books that I'm reading a little bit more. I only want to read books that excite me. I don't want to be giving books a try that I have absolutely no interest in anymore. I do still think that every book has the potential to surprise me and become a new favorite, even if I'm not necessarily super enthusiastic about picking it up to start off with. But my time is precious, and I would rather invest that time in things that I want to read than things that I don't. So I'm interested to see what effect that has on my statistics when we get to the end of 2026. But to dive into 2025, we'll start with my Goodreads goal as always. 2024 was quite a good reading year for me, and I always set my goal to one more book than I read the year previously. So my goal for 2025 was to read 110 books. Now, unfortunately, I only read 95 books, and I'm not too mad about it. I knew as we were approaching the end of the year that I wasn't going to be hitting 110. I did low-key try and hit 100, but I'm not the kind of person who will just read like short books or graphic novels just for the sake of hitting a Goodreads goal. It's not that deep for me, so I didn't quite make it. It's fine. My Goodreads goal is 96 books for 2026, and we'll see if I hit it. Obviously, I did read 14 books less than I read in 2024. I've had a bit of trouble with motivation regarding reading over, I want to say, like the last 6 months for sure, and that is why I want to prioritize books that I'm super enthusiastic and excited about going into the next year. But generally, while I set a Goodreads goal as something to aim for, just like obviously one better than I did the year before, I generally don't really care that much about how much I read, and I actually care a little bit more about the amount of pages that I read than the total amount of books anyway, because I do tend to read quite thick books. I finished the Wheel of Time series this year. I read all of the John Gwynne books, the first 4 of which are not very small, and then a couple of like chunky romantasy books as well. So my total pages for 2025 was 40,594. This is 3,439 pages less than I read in 2024. So I have overall read a little bit less, but the way that I count my pages that I present to you guys in my monthly wrap up and the exact amount of pages I read in a month are slightly different. So the totals that you're getting here and the total that you get in the wrap up is the amount of pages in completed books that I've read. So the first book that I read for this year was The Light of All That Falls by James Islington. That was like an 800-page book. I only read 300 pages in January, but all 800 pages of that book are going to contribute towards my January total. That's just the way that I prefer to do it, because it gives me a better average of like how many pages per book I'm reading, and also like the page count is represented by the total books. But I do also track my pages a separate way. I have a separate sheet on my spreadsheet where I track the pages per day. So how many pages do I read every single day? And I will admit, because this requires me to actually fill it out every day, I am not super accurate about it. Sometimes, especially at the end of the month, I do taper off filling it out. So this is not super accurate, but if we go off the total that is in my pages per day sheet, I read 42,237 pages. Now, bear in mind, I've just told you there's many days throughout the year where I've forgotten to fill this in, but that is still nearly 2,000 more pages than is represented by completed books. And I think that the reason why this is my worst reading year in terms of the amount that I've read since 2022 is the sheer amount of books that I'm DNFing. I am currently, I want to say, DNFing at least 2 books per month. A few years ago, I didn't really DNF anything. Then it got to the point where I DNF'd the odd book. Last year, 2024, I would DNF like at least 1 a month. Now it's 2 a month. I'm just being more realistic about kind of what I want to read and what I want to continue on with. I have not previously tracked the books that I DNF because typically there hasn't been that many of them. I did track it one year and made a video, and then I didn't bother to track it the following year. But I do think I'm going to add a page onto my spreadsheet to keep a note of all of the books that I'm DNFing so that we can see. I also might add a section that says like what page, like at what point in the book I'm DNFing, so I can get a better idea of like what my accurate page total might be. I'm not interested in tracking DNF books as read. I never have been. I know some people do, but for me, I only care about statistics from books that I've read. DNFs, I think, skew that data, and I don't really want to do that. But also, I think that this is going to be interesting as something I'm doing in 2026 when I'm trying to be intentional about only picking up books that I'm enthusiastic about. In theory, that means that I'll be DNFing less books. So we'll see what happens. I've just had that realization once again that I need to add graphs into this video. So let's move me up a little bit more so I have space to do so. So for the types of books that I read, this is where I went completely off the rails because the amount of books that I reread, pretty negligible every year. The amount of standalones that I read, don't really have a goal for that. I tend to be more of a series reader anyway, so this is like a 2% increase on 2024. The amount of sequels that I read is 27%. I read 21% less sequels in 2025, and the new series that I started is at 46%, which is a 20% increase. I started nearly 50 series last year, and the year before I had a goal to read twice as many sequels as series. I can't believe that I only read 26 sequels last year. Who even am I? So that is like, I don't want to be like it's unacceptable, because honestly it's not that deep, it's just books, but that is something that I definitely need to change. I need to be reading sequels. I have took a different approach to series in terms of having a lot of first books of series on my TBR. I want to kind of read through them and decide which ones I want to continue on with and which ones I don't, and then cycling back around to the ones that I'm excited about at maybe a little bit of a later date, which I've been doing with my reread and resume project. But I'm pretty sure that the reason why this is so imbalanced is due to shelve it or scrap it. I've talked before about the difference between making content about reading and reading for content, and I actually discussed it recently. I really can't remember what video it was in, but essentially reading for content is like tailoring your reading around the content that you would like to make, and making content about reading is kind of reading more organically and then just documenting that. Now, throughout the history of my channel, I would say I've typically been more of a person who makes content about reading, but it depends what mood I'm in. If I'm more enthusiastic about reading, then I will make content about reading, and then sometimes I'm more enthusiastic about content creation, and then I'll like read for content. I feel like in 2025 I was definitely focused on shelve it or scrap it. I made my shelve it or scrap it goals quite lofty. I had to read the same amount of books as I'd hauled in the previous month, and then I started working with publishers on various things, which we see represented in the statistics as well, and that caused me to haul more books because I was receiving them to promote for publishers. And then I was just pretty much only reading for shelve it or scrap it, and the majority of the stuff that I read for that is things that I'm maybe unsure about. And so that's, I think, how we ended up starting so many series. But after the episode of shelve it or scrap it that I'm currently working on, I am going to be redrafting the rules. I'm not sure exactly what they're going to be, but for the next era, the next year of shelve it or scrap it, I'm not going to be balancing those hauls anymore. I'm going to do something a little bit different to try and rein this in a little bit, to fit in with my ethos of reading a little bit more intentionally and only reading books that I'm more excited about, and that should hopefully help to rein this statistic in a little bit as well. Obviously this wasn't the best year in terms of the amount of books that I read, and I feel like that is definitely illustrated with the books that I was reading per month. So generally I was reading less month to month as I have been in years in the past. I only read more than 10 books. My average was between like 9 and 12 or 8 and 12, I would say, tended to be where I fell. Typically I was reading around 10 books a month, I would say, and I only read more than 10 books in 3 months of the year, which was March, May and September. My best reading month was March and my worst was April. April was bad because I was away for 2 weeks of it, and March was really good because I was making reading vlogs to go up while I was away. So I know why they kind of balanced out the way that they did. It makes perfect sense. In terms of my star ratings, now we do see a little bit of an improvement here, and I'm wondering if this is because I've been DNFing so much, because the most noticeable thing that we have here is that I only had 8 2-star reads last year, which is 14 less than in 2024. I had 22 2-star reads in 2024, which is wild to me. And then for the 3 stars, I had 7 less. I had 4 more 4 stars and 2 more 5 stars. So the DNFs are clearly working because I'm having less 2 and 3 star reads, which are the books that I'm DNFing, and slightly more 4 or 5 star reads. I would like to see less 3-star reads still, because that is like 3 and 4 star ratings are my most common, which makes sense, but I would like to see less 3 stars in 2026. Definitely more 5 stars. My personal goal is to have at least 10 5-star books in 2026. I don't know if it's possible, but we'll see. For the demographics, I have very little to report here. The only thing of note really is that I read a singular middle grade this year, whereas in 2024 I didn't. If I do read middle grade, it's like maybe it's less than 3 a year, I want to say. Young adult, very similar, only a 2% increase on 2024. Adult is down 2%, new adult is down 1%. I think I've very much settled in the demographics that I'm reading from now, because adult has been very close to 75% for the last 3 years, and I don't really anticipate that changing very much, if I'm being honest, because I do predominantly read adult books with just a little bit of YA, and then the very occasional new adult or middle grade in there. So we just have one significant change in the formats that I've been reading, and I bet that you guys can guess what it is if you've been following along with my reading over the last year, and that is that I'm reading significantly more ebooks. This year, 27% of the books that I read were ebooks, and that was a 17% increase on 2024. So this is literally because I got a Kindle last year, and then I got a Libby account. So now whenever I start a book, the first thing I do is look if it is available on Libby or whether it's on Kindle Unlimited. And if it is, I read it on Kindle instead of reading the physical edition. It's just honestly a lot more comfortable, especially if you read a lot of fantasy, especially adult epic fantasy has very small font. I also have quite a lot of hardbacks, and it just makes so much more sense for me to read an ebook copy when they are available and I don't have to pay any money for them than trying to balance my book and sit in more uncomfortable positions. And also in terms of traveling, I went on quite a few London day trips last year. It's so much easier to take my Kindle than a book, and if I'm traveling any further afield for a longer length of time, I don't like to take physical books with me. So my Kindle has very much changed the way that I'm reading. I will say though, the format that I read very heavily depends on my mood. There was a whole month, I think, where I only listened to audiobooks, which there was things going on, which is the reason why I could only really listen to audiobooks and I couldn't read anything physically. It couldn't hold my attention. But since then, I don't think I've listened to a single audiobook. And then sometimes like the thought of physically holding a book and having to read like an actual book is just really off-putting to me, and I don't want to read it unless I can read an ebook. And then vice versa as well. Sometimes at the minute I'm really into like actually physically reading a book as opposed to an ebook. I don't know why it's so mood dependent, but it's definitely something that I've noticed. And the only other real change that we have in here is that 3% of the books that I read are ARCs, which is 3% more than 2024 because, as I said, I've been working with publishers a lot more in 2025, and this is something that I'm expecting to continue to increase. I currently have 7 books on my TBR to read between January and April, and I know that I have at least one more on the way, so I think that that is going to, if everything kind of continues as it has been over the last 6 months, I want to say, I feel like ARCs are going to become a not super significant portion of my reading, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw that creep up to maybe like between 10 and 20% for 2026. My genre breakdown was a little bit spooky. It freaked me out a little bit when I was writing my notes. My big 2 genres are always fantasy and fantasy romance. My next most dominant ones are typically always romance and sci-fi, although they only account for maybe like 10% of my reading. But this year, 36% of the books I read were fantasy. That is a 0% increase or decrease on 2024, exactly the same. I do round up or down as well, just to make note, so they will be very slightly different because I read a different amount of books. The fantasy romance is at 24%. That is once again a 0% increase or decrease on last year, exactly the same. Romance is down 1.4%. So very, very small amount. And that is my 3rd biggest genre of 2025. This is almost identical to 2024. The rest of them are all over the place. For example, I read 3, I think, contemporary books this year. I didn't read any in 2024, but the main genres that I read the most from almost identical to 2024. So then I decided to dig a little bit deeper, and I went through all of my past spreadsheets I started tracking in 2019, and I discovered that the balance of fantasy, romance, and romance have been almost exactly the same, within 1.1% difference between years since 2023. So 23, 24, and 25, these 3 genres have only changed by maybe 1%, which is crazy. I know obviously that these are the genres that I read the most of, but for them to be exactly the same every year, I'm very surprised as well, because I did the romantasy rundown in April where I read 12 fantasy romance books. I think I DNF'd 2, so I read 10 fantasy romance books in a short space of time, which when I've done that in the past, like I read all of the books in the selection series one year, that heavily skewed my statistics to like young adult dystopian. So I expected the romantasy to be skewed a little bit because I focused on it for a project, but no, I'm still a little freaked out by that. So next up, let's talk about the sources. This is a place where I'm acquiring the books that I'm reading. The only really significant thing that we need to talk about here is in line with what we've already said in this video, and that is that 11% of the books that I read in 2025 were sent to me by the publisher. Everything else else is pretty usual. 59% of the books were from my own TBR, which means that I owned them before 2025. That's a 3% increase. The books that I've held are the ones that I've acquired in 2025. That's a 2% decrease. And I've been using my library a little bit less, but I did say that I wanted to because I was using it as a loophole to be able to avoid reading the books that I already owned, essentially. So I put restrictions on how I could use the library, and I could only have like one book out at a time. I did get all of the Wheel of Time books that I read. I can't remember how many of the Wheel of Time books I read this year versus 2024, but all of those I did get physical copies from the library. And on the occasion that I read a book from Libby and I didn't own a physical copy, I marked those as library as well. So all of the ebooks that I've read from Libby that are just ebook copies of books I already own, I have marked down as owned TBR, and that's the same if I get a audiobook of Audible. Audible is represented this year because I listen to a few of the Dungeon Crawler Carl books, but I don't own them physically. But if I do listen to an audiobook copy on Spotify or Audible and I already own the book, I count the physical owned book and where that came from, as opposed to where I got the audiobook that I listened to. So this is the area of my spreadsheet where I'm going to be making the most changes going into 2026, because this type of categorization, the way I've been utilizing this, does not make sense anymore. And the specific parts of it that don't make sense are the owned TBR versus hold sections, because I'm making a distinction if the book is sent to me by the publisher, but I'm not making a distinction on whether it was gifted to me or whether I bought it myself or whether it came from a subscription box. All of those things are just split between did I have them before or after the start of the year, and they go into own TBR or hold, whereas I'm weirdly making a distinction if I am sent something by a publisher or if I read it from the library. So I've decided to both expand upon this and also break it down a little bit more. I'm going to be removing the own TBR and hold element, and I'm going to kind of be making that its separate thing, which is this a book that I owned before the start of the year, or is it one that I have hold this year? And that is across all brackets. So if it's a book that was sent to me by the publisher last year, it'll go in last year. If it was sent to me by the publisher this year, it will go in this year. And then for the specific sources element, I'm going to be adding more categories here. I'm definitely going to be adding a subscription box section. So that is like if it's a subscription box book that I read. I don't know yet whether I'm going to break it down by subscription box. The most subscription box books I have come from Fairyloot because I'm a rep for all three of their monthly subs and their quarterly epic, and then I have extra special editions that I've bought myself on top of that. But I do obviously still have quite a lot of Illumicrate books. I've still got some old Owlcrate books hanging around. I do think though that it'll just be Fairyloot dominant, and I don't think that that's necessarily as important for me to track as just whether it came from a subscription box. So I think I'll go with that, and then also I'll be using this to track whether the book was gifted, whether I bought it myself, and taken whether it was hauled this year or last year or years previous into a separate statistic. Something else that I'm also adding, just out of curiosity, this was inspired by Win from Literary Diversions actually. I've added a checkbox to the sheet where I record the books that I've hauled that is going to tell me what percentage of the books that I've hauled I've read. I'm kind of in a place right now where I'm definitely obviously focusing on the books that I have owned for a while as opposed to new ones, but I do still feel like I have a pretty good mix. I mean, 18%, 20% of the books that I read this year are ones that I've hauled, 60% are backlist, which I think is a pretty good split. But I want to know the exact ratio of new books I'm acquiring that I'm reading, and maybe once I see where I'm at with that, I'll make a decision whether that's an area that I want to make any changes in or not. Something else that has changed drastically, this one honestly shocked me, and that is my author relationship wheel. So this has never been one that I've made any effort to make it skew a certain way. This is essentially just whether I've read from an author before or whether they are new to me. And I've never really known what I want the split to be, because I want to continue to read from authors that I love, but I also want to branch out and discover new authors. And even though I've never put any effort into this area of my reading, it has always from 2019 to 2024, it has always been very close to a 60-40 split, with 60% of the books that I read coming from authors I've read from before and 40% of the books that I read coming from new authors. Never ever in my history of tracking my reading has the authors that are new to me overtaken the authors that I already know. This year, 51% of the books that I read were from authors that were new to me. That's a 16% increase. And 46% of the books that I read were from authors that I've read from before, which is a 17% decrease. Now, I can't be sure without doing a really elaborate deep dive, but I think that this could potentially correlate to the difference that we had this year in sequels that I read versus new series that I started. Because obviously, if I'm reading less sequels are generally by the same author that read the previous books in the series. So generally, if I'm reading more sequels, I'm reading more from authors that I've read from in the past. And if I'm starting new series, there's obviously so much more potential to be reading from authors that are new to me. Like I said, cannot confirm or deny that without doing the breakdown, and I don't really feel like doing it, but that is just a theory that I had for why this has changed for the first time in like 7 years. And then the debut portion of this, I actually only record a author as a debut if they are still a debut author when I read the book. So if I read Robin Hobb's debut book, I wouldn't count it as a debut because she's written many, many books since then. This is always very, very tiny. I also think that there's a lot of potential that I'm just recording authors as new or known and forgetting that debut is an option when I'm inputting books. And I would say that it's highly likely I've made that mistake at least once on my spreadsheet. But the debut section is always a very, very tiny percentage of what I read because I don't tend to read books as soon as they're published. Like, I do feel like I read more backlist than I do new stuff. I mean, it's literally illustrated in here with 20% of the books that I read hauled this year versus 60% that were from my TBR that existed prior to the start of 2025. I do see potential for this to increase in the future though, now that I'm working with publishers more. If I receive ARCs and I'm committed to read them before a certain date, then I am of course going to be potentially reading more debut authors. And then the final thing we have to talk about is the publishing wheel. So obviously there's a lot going on here. We never break down the entire thing, just see if there's anything super noticeable going on. I think the most obvious thing to talk about here is that the publisher that I've read from the most is Penguin at 18%, and that is an 11% increase on 2024. This has never happened before. It's not usually Penguin. It is either self-published or like indie books were the majority of the wheel for a very long time, which we'll talk about in a second. And if not that, then it's normally a fantasy imprint like Orbit or Tor or Harper Voyager. But I became an ambassador for Penguin Michael Joseph in the spring of 2025. So they've sent me just like books in general, which have made their way to my TBR. So there's more chance that I'm picking a Penguin book up. If they're not an actual arc, I haven't necessarily been making them a super big priority to read. If it's just a finished copy, it just gets added to my TBR, but it usually gets added to the stacks. And the more books that Penguin add to the stacks, the more likely it is that I'm going to be picking up Penguin books. So I definitely think that's why Penguin are dominating this. I have had a lot of really good luck though with Romantasy published by Penguin Michael Joseph in 2025. So I think that organically going forward, as I pursue those sequels, you're going to see a lot of Penguin next year as well. Tor have a 9% increase on last year. They represent 12% of the books that I read. And Orbit is at 10%, which is very similar to where they were at last year. I think the reason why I've read so many more Tor books this year is because John Gwynne is published by Tor, and I read all of the Banished Land books, so they account for 6 of the books published by Tor that I read in 2025. Something very obvious to me, having crunched these numbers for many, many years now, is that I only read one self-published book in 2025, which is wild to me because this used to be, as I just said, the majority of my pie chart. This peaked at 25% in 2021 and 2022. I think in 2020 it was 15%. Last year, I think it may be around 15. 2023, I think it was around 20. For a long time, it's been a significant portion of this wheel. But I think the reason why it isn't this year is not actually because my reading habits have changed. I think it's actually more to do with the fact that traditional publishing has been buying up all of the indies. So I'm still reading the same kind of books that I would have been reading. It's just they've been traditionally published. And and I'm reading traditionally published books as opposed to self-published books. So those were my reading stats for 2025. I think we actually had some interesting findings. The irony of this is that when I said that I maybe wouldn't do a stats video this year, the reason was because over the last few years, nothing had really changed about my reading. I didn't really have much to report. It was just like very tiny percentage increases and decreases, or for example, like when I read the selection series and that heavily influenced the statistics in one particular way, organically nothing was really changing. So I find it really ironic that now that we've come to the 2026 version, some of my statistics are all over the place. Now that I'm aware of this, I'm interested to see whether they will kind of go back. I know, like I said, the amount of books that I'm reading that have been sent by the publisher I think is going to increase. We're going to get some new data now that I'm changing up the sources a little bit. So I'm excited to see what the next year of reading has in store for me, especially in January. I'm so enthusiastic about reading, and then we get to the midpoint of the year and I start to feel a little bit more deflated. I'm really curious how this year is going to go though. If I manage to keep up the ethos of only reading books that I'm excited about, we could be seeing a vastly different set of statistics for 2026, and it is going to be difficult to kind of maintain that because I do have some obligations. Shelve it or scrap it sometimes pushes me towards a book that I wouldn't necessarily have picked up in that moment. I have book club obligations and other things going on that are out of my control a little bit more. But I think what I've noticed just in general throughout my reading is that sometimes progress is slow. By wanting to read a little bit more intentionally and pick up things that I'm more enthusiastic about this year, maybe it won't shape my entire reading year, but by the time we get to 2027, which I don't even want to talk about that, we'll be in a place where every book I read is one that I'm super excited and enthusiastic about. But I'm just really excited to see what the next year has in store. So down in my comments, leave me a little like statistics graph or like number or maths emoji, something like that, if you would like to let me know you were here but you don't feel like you have anything to say, or if you have anything to comment on regarding my statistics, then feel free. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram, or my Patreon if you'd like to follow me on any of those. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're go when nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.